Rebecca Lewis was the kind of teacher parents trusted and students admired, but behind her polished smile and respected career, she hid a secret so dark it would shatter families, ruin lives, and turn her name into one of the most infamous scandals her town had ever known. Rebecca Lewis appeared to be the perfect example of a devoted teacher and caring wife, the kind of woman who neighbors greeted warmly and students admired for her dedication. On the surface, she lived a quiet suburban life with her husband and 2 children, teaching English at the local high school and balancing family responsibilities with what seemed like grace. To everyone around her, Rebecca's life looked ordinary, even enviable. What nobody knew was that beneath the calm and controlled exterior, she was hiding a dangerous secret that would soon destroy everything she had built. Her story began with small, almost invisible steps across boundaries that most teachers would never dare to cross, but those steps quickly turned into a descent that she could no longer control. It started with a student who often stayed behind after class, claiming he needed extra help with assignments. Rebecca, eager to maintain her reputation as a caring teacher, agreed. At first, their conversations were innocent, centered around literature and homework. But over time, the meetings began to shift. The student started to confide in her about his personal struggles, and Rebecca, flattered by the attention and trust, offered comfort. In her mind, it was harmless, a chance to guide a teenager through difficulties. Yet the bond deepened in ways that blurred the line between teacher and student. What might have been a single lapse in judgment turned into a secret relationship that she convinced herself she could keep under control. The thrill of being desired by someone younger awakened something reckless in Rebecca. She found herself looking forward to the hidden glances, the coded messages, and the secret rendezvous. Her marriage, though stable, had grown dull over the years, and she felt invisible in her own home. The affair became her escape, a dangerous source of excitement that quickly consumed her thoughts. The risk of discovery only intensified the feelings, and she began to crave the danger as much as the attention. One affair might have been enough to end her career if discovered, but Rebecca did not stop there. Once she had crossed the line, the boundaries dissolved completely. It wasn't long before she found herself involved with another student, then another, until eventually she had entangled herself with 5 different boys from the same school. Each one believed he was special, that he held a secret connection with his teacher that nobody else could understand. Rebecca thrived on the control and the secrecy, convinced that she could manage the chaos. She never imagined how quickly it could all collapse. The students, however, were not as careful as she thought. In hallways, they exchanged subtle glances and inside jokes, unaware that others were beginning to notice. Friends overheard fragments of conversations that didn't make sense, hints of something bigger lurking beneath the surface. Whispers began to spread through the school, and while rumors among teenagers are common, these stories carried a consistency that made them hard to dismiss. Staff members grew uneasy, though none had proof, and parents started to sense something strange in the behavior of their sons. Rebecca ignored the growing tension, blind to the danger, believing that as long as she remained calm, nobody would ever dare accuse her of something so unthinkable. But one of the boys was more calculating than the rest. He began keeping records, saving text messages, and taking secret photos that showed Rebecca in compromising situations. Perhaps it was an attempt to hold on to the proof of their relationship, or perhaps he had already begun planning how to use it. Rebecca had no idea that her most dangerous threat came not from outside suspicions, but from within the circle of students she thought she controlled. The very people she trusted to keep her secret safe were the ones who would ultimately bring it crashing down. At home, her husband started to notice subtle changes. Rebecca was distracted, often glued to her phone, disappearing into other rooms to answer messages. She returned late from school with flimsy excuses about grading papers or organizing student projects. Though he questioned her explanations, he wanted to believe her. The thought of betrayal never fully crossed his mind, not from the woman he had built a life with. Yet the unease grew with each passing day, gnawing at him in ways he couldn't ignore. Rebecca continued weaving her double life with increasing recklessness. She balanced her role as wife and mother during the day while indulging in her secret at night. She became skilled at compartmentalizing her world, shifting effortlessly from reading bedtime stories to exchanging forbidden messages with her students. She convinced herself that nobody would ever put the pieces together, that she was too careful, too clever, but the walls were already closing in around her. The first warning arrived in a way she never expected. One evening, Rebecca found an envelope in her mailbox with no name and no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence written in bold black ink: "We know everything." Her heart pounded as she read the words over and over again, trying to make sense of who could have sent it. At first she dismissed it as a cruel prank, maybe a neighborhood teenager playing a joke. But the phrasing gnawed at her, and deep down she felt the sharp edge of fear. For the first time, Rebecca realized that her secret was not as safe as she believed. Despite the fear, she carried on, unwilling to let go of the thrill that had taken over her life. She told herself it was nothing, that nobody would ever dare expose her. But beneath her confident exterior, cracks had begun to form. The boys were no longer silent, the rumors no longer contained, and the threat was no longer imaginary. Rebecca Lewis had built her life on secrets, but secrets have a way of surfacing, and hers were about to explode in ways she could never control. The unease inside the school grew heavier with each passing week, though most people could not put their finger on why. Teachers sensed tension among a small group of boys who carried themselves with unusual confidence, the kind of arrogance that seemed to sprout from knowing something nobody else did. They whispered in corners, smirked at inappropriate times, and shared subtle gestures that only they understood. To other students it looked like a clique formed around a secret. To staff it looked like teenage mischief. But in truth, it was the outward sign of something far more dangerous. A sign of Rebecca Lewis's private life bleeding into the public world. Rebecca noticed the behavior too, though she brushed it off. She believed she had control, that her authority as a teacher made her untouchable. In her mind, the boys were reckless but loyal, tied to her by the allure of secrecy and the fear of being exposed themselves. What she underestimated was the volatility of teenage emotions. Jealousy, competition, and insecurity began to creep into their relationships, and she failed to see the storm building beneath the surface. Her home life reflected the same unraveling. Her husband, Mark, had become suspicious of her constant absences. Rebecca claimed she was running after-school programs, helping struggling students, or attending late meetings. At first, Mark accepted these explanations, but over time he saw patterns forming. She never allowed him to pick her up from school, avoided sharing details about her workload, and seemed emotionally distant at home. The once predictable routine of their marriage grew fractured. Mark's instincts told him something was wrong, though he still could not imagine the full truth. The more Rebecca tried to maintain her balance, the more tangled her double life became. She would host dinner for her family while secretly planning a meeting with one of the boys afterward. She would spend hours crafting assignments for her class, but use the same time to message one of her students late into the night. Each lie layered on top of another, building a fragile tower that could collapse with the smallest push. She convinced herself she was safe because nobody had confronted her directly, but cracks were spreading everywhere. The boys began to clash privately. Each believed he was more important to Rebecca than the others. When one spotted her favoring another, jealousy burned. They carried that tension back into school hallways, where their behavior became increasingly reckless. One of them boasted to a close friend about his secret relationship with the teacher. Another, not wanting to be overshadowed, hinted that he too had a connection with her. Slowly, the rumors grew louder, spreading from locker rooms to lunch tables, then into classrooms where other students whispered behind notebooks. At first, school staff ignored the gossip. Teenage rumors often ran wild, and many seemed too outrageous to be believed. But there was a consistency to these stories that unsettled the more observant teachers. The same names were mentioned, the same strange behaviors noted. Rebecca's habit of keeping certain boys after class or calling on them more often than others added fuel to the suspicion. No one had evidence, but the atmosphere shifted, and people began to watch her more closely. Meanwhile, Mark's suspicions hardened into determination. One night, while Rebecca was in the shower, he glanced at her phone and found that her messages were locked with a new password. His unease deepened. On her laptop, he noticed she had created hidden folders, ones she quickly minimized whenever he walked into the room. Though he did not yet confront her, he began quietly observing, making mental notes of her inconsistencies. What Rebecca did not realize was that her husband's patience had limits, and his silence was not ignorance, it was strategy. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Late one evening, Rebecca found another anonymous message slipped into her mailbox. This time it was more direct. It contained a photo, blurry but recognizable, of her standing too close to one of her students near her car. The message underneath was simple: "You can't hide forever." Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to believe it was an empty threat. She tore up the letter and buried it deep in the trash, never telling Mark or anyone else. Yet the fear clung to her, seeping into her daily life. Rebecca grew more paranoid, scanning hallways for eyes that lingered too long, wondering who had seen her or who might be watching. She noticed students staring at her in ways they never had before, some with suspicion, others with knowing smirks. She became harsher in class, desperate to assert authority, but the stricter she grew, the more the rumors spread. Fear began to gnaw at her confidence, but she still refused to back away from the dangerous path she had chosen. One of the boys, fueled by jealousy, finally broke the unspoken pact of silence. In a heated argument with another student, he blurted out that he was with Rebecca. The word spread like wildfire. Within days, half the school had heard the claim. Some dismissed it as bravado, but others began connecting the dots. A counselor heard fragments of these conversations and grew deeply concerned. Unlike other staff members, the counselor could not ignore it. The matter was too serious, too dangerous to overlook. A note was written, and a meeting was scheduled with the principal. Rebecca, oblivious to the fact that official eyes were turning toward her, tried to carry on as though nothing had changed. She continued messaging the boys, continued sneaking around, convinced she could manage the growing pressure. What she didn't realize was that the foundation beneath her was already crumbling. Every careless mistake, every reckless decision had created openings for her secret to escape. At home, Mark finally reached his breaking point. One evening, he quietly followed her after she claimed she had to stay late for grading. From a distance, he watched as she met with one of the boys in the dim light of the school parking lot. The scene confirmed his worst fears. Though he did not approach her, his mind hardened with betrayal and rage. He now had no doubt, and in his silence he began plotting how to gather evidence that could not be denied. Rebecca returned home that night pretending everything was normal, never realizing her husband had seen what she thought was hidden. The walls were closing in, but she still clung to her lies, blind to how close the truth was to breaking her life apart. The rumors inside the school continued to build, now reaching the ears of administrators who could no longer dismiss them. Parents began to call, expressing concern about their son's unusual behavior. The principal, though skeptical, felt obligated to investigate. The seeds of exposure had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before Rebecca's secret life exploded into public scandal. The situation reached a breaking point when one of the boys, overwhelmed by jealousy and anger, confided in a close friend about his secret relationship with Rebecca Lewis. The friend listened in shock, torn between disbelief and disgust. Instead of keeping it to himself, he shared the story with another student who then told a teacher. What began as a single whispered confession quickly spread like an uncontrollable fire. Within days, the rumor became too loud to ignore, reaching the school counselor's office. The counselor, bound by duty, took immediate action and brought the disturbing information to the principal. For the first time, the whispers of students were no longer just background noise. They were now the subject of an official concern. Rebecca sensed the shift in the air. Students avoided her eyes, conversations hushed as she entered classrooms, and the air of respect she once commanded had turned sour. Though nobody confronted her directly, she could feel the weight of suspicion pressing down on her. She dismissed it outwardly, insisting to herself that teenagers invented stories all the time, but the fear began to claw at her confidence. She was no longer untouchable. Meanwhile, her husband Mark had reached a devastating discovery. For weeks he had observed her with quiet suspicion, but now he had undeniable proof. On her laptop, he found a series of messages she had carelessly left open one evening. They were explicit, filled with words that pierced him like knives. The messages were not vague. Not something that could be explained away, they were clear evidence of her betrayal with students, confirming the rumors that were beginning to surface in the school. Mark's heart shattered, but instead of confronting Rebecca, he made a calculated decision. He began saving the messages, taking photographs of her screen, and documenting every detail he could find. His silence at home masked a growing storm inside him. Rebecca continued her double life, unaware that her husband was turning her own secrets into a file that could destroy her. She believed she was still in control, still managing the chaos, but she underestimated the people around her. The students she had entangled were no longer unified by secrecy. Some were angry, others confused, and one was determined to expose everything. That boy, driven by a toxic blend of betrayal and revenge, handed over photographs he had secretly taken. The images showed Rebecca with him in compromising positions, evidence too strong to be dismissed as rumor or fabrication. When investigators arrived at the school, the entire atmosphere changed overnight. Students whispered with a mix of fear and fascination as rumors of a police presence spread. Rebecca felt her stomach churn when she was called into the principal's office unexpectedly. She walked down the hall with feigned confidence, but her pulse raced. Inside the office, she was met with formal questions, carefully worded, but she could sense the weight behind them. Though she denied everything, her denial was thin against the growing pile of evidence. She left the meeting shaken, aware that the walls of secrecy she had built were cracking wide open. At home, Mark's patience finally ran out. He handed his collected evidence to the police, unwilling to let her escape the consequences of what she had done. He did not tell her what he had done. Instead, he watched her carry on her charade, knowing it would soon collapse. Rebecca noticed his coldness, his silence, but assumed it was the natural distance that had crept into their marriage. She had no idea that the man sleeping beside her was the one tightening the noose around her secret life. The investigators began piecing together the truth. They traced phone records, pulled copies of messages from seized devices, and matched the students' testimonies with the timeline of events. Each interview revealed more detail, more consistency, until the picture became undeniable. The boys described similar patterns, the same methods of secrecy, the same promises whispered in private. Their words painted a haunting portrait of a teacher who had crossed every professional and moral boundary. One student, still conflicted and ashamed, provided the final blow. He revealed a hidden stash of photos he had taken on his phone, documenting their encounters. Though some of the images were blurry, they were clear enough to confirm Rebecca's involvement. For investigators, it was the missing piece that tied the allegations together into a solid case. For Rebecca, it was the end of her fragile illusion of control. Word of the investigation leaked quickly into the community. Parents, horrified and furious, began demanding answers from the school. News outlets caught wind of the scandal, and reporters circled the town like vultures. Rebecca's name was whispered in hushed tones at grocery stores and shouted across social media. The once respected teacher had become the subject of public outrage before she had even been formally charged. At school, the pressure became unbearable. Rebecca noticed the way colleagues avoided her, how parents glared at her during school events, how students smirked behind her back. She felt isolated, hunted, and powerless. Still, she clung to denial, telling herself that investigators had nothing concrete, that it was all gossip twisted into lies. But inside, she knew the truth was too heavy to keep hidden forever. One evening, she arrived home to find her husband's side of the closet half empty. Mark had packed bags and taken their children to his sister's house without saying a word. On the kitchen counter, he left a single sheet of paper, divorce papers unsigned, waiting for her. For Rebecca, the reality of her downfall struck harder than any interrogation. She realized she had already lost her family before the court could even take her freedom. The official charges came soon after. Detectives arrived at her home with warrants in hand. Rebecca was questioned, her devices seized, her private world dismantled piece by piece. The interviews with students were stacked against her, each detail aligning too closely with the others to be dismissed as lies. For the first time, she sat in silence, unable to talk her way out of the trap she had woven for herself. Her arrest became a spectacle. Neighbors gathered outside as police cars pulled up to her house. Reporters recorded every moment, cameras flashing as Rebecca was led out in handcuffs. The image of her being escorted away would be replayed across television screens and online headlines for weeks. The perfect teacher, the devoted wife, the admired neighbor exposed as someone entirely different. Someone darker, someone who had betrayed every ounce of trust placed in her. By the time she was placed in a holding cell, Rebecca understood the full extent of her collapse. She had lost her family, her career, her reputation, and soon her freedom. The students she thought she controlled had turned into the very evidence that sealed her fate. Every secret she had tried to bury had risen to the surface, dragging her down into a reality she could no longer escape. The day of Rebecca Lewis's arrest became a turning point, not only for her life but for the entire community that had once admired her. It began early in the morning when police cruisers pulled quietly onto her suburban street, their presence quickly attracting the attention of curious neighbors peeking out from behind curtains. Within minutes, whispers turned into a gathering of onlookers as officers approached her front door. Rebecca, still dressed in a simple blouse and skirt she had planned to wear to school, froze at the sound of the knock. When she opened the door to see detectives standing there, badges displayed, her world collapsed in an instant. They informed her she was under arrest. Before she could process the words, her wrists were pulled behind her and locked in cold handcuffs. The scene played out on the front lawn as her children stood in shock, crying and clinging to their father, who had already packed their belongings days earlier. Neighbors watched in disbelief, some covering their mouths, others recording on their phones. Rebecca had spent years cultivating an image of respect and professionalism, and now that image was shattered under flashing cameras and public humiliation. News crews arrived swiftly, alerted by police scanners and the growing noise of the crowd. The footage of Rebecca being led into a patrol car would dominate evening broadcasts, her name plastered across headlines as the disgraced teacher accused of preying on her students. Reporters scrambled to gather details, interviewing stunned residents who struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the crimes being alleged. To the outside world, it was a shocking betrayal. To those directly involved, it was the inevitable end to months of secrecy. In the days that followed, the courtroom became the stage for Rebecca's downfall. She entered in shackles, her once neat appearance replaced with the plain orange uniform of the county jail. The woman who had once commanded classrooms with confidence now sat hunched, eyes cast downward as the charges were read aloud. Each word carried the weight of her actions, echoing through the chamber filled with reporters, parents, and curious townspeople. The prosecution wasted no time painting her as a predator who abused her authority, manipulating the vulnerable boys entrusted to her care. The students, once bound to her by secrecy, now stood on the opposite side of the courtroom. Their testimonies were delivered in voices that trembled with anger, shame, and confusion. Some described how Rebecca had drawn them in with promises of trust and affection, only to entangle them in relationships they barely understood. Others spoke bitterly about the manipulation and lies, how she convinced them they were special while doing the same with others. Their accounts, though painful, fit together like pieces of a puzzle, each one adding depth to the portrait of Rebecca's betrayal. Parents filled the gallery, their faces twisted with grief and outrage. They had trusted Rebecca to guide their children academically, never imagining she would exploit them instead. For many, the anger extended beyond her alone. They blamed the school for not acting sooner, for ignoring the warning signs and rumors until it was too late. Some demanded resignations, while others threatened lawsuits. The scandal fractured the community, turning neighbor against neighbor, teacher against parent, and friend against friend. Trust, once abundant, was now scarce. Rebecca's defense tried to frame her actions as the result of emotional instability, portraying her as a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, desperate for validation. They argued that she had been mentally fragile, that the relationships were mistakes born out of weakness rather than malice. But the evidence told a harsher story. Photographs, text messages, and digital records revealed a pattern of calculated behavior that could not be excused by loneliness. The prosecution emphasized that Rebecca was not a victim but an adult who chose to cross boundaries again and again. Mark, her husband, sat through every session of the trial without speaking. His face betrayed no emotion as he listened to the evidence, though inside he was a storm of anger and sorrow. For him, the betrayal was not only personal but public, his family dragged through humiliation because of Rebecca's choices. He had already filed for divorce and secured custody of their children, ensuring they would not have to face their mother again in the near future. Yet his presence in the courtroom was a silent judgment, a reminder to Rebecca of the life she had destroyed. Rebecca attempted to address the court during her trial, her voice shaking as she pleaded for understanding. She insisted she never meant to harm anyone, that she had lost herself in a spiral she could not escape. But her words were hollow against the mountain of evidence stacked against her. The jury watched impassively, their decision already forming long before her statement ended. To them, she was not a misunderstood woman, but a teacher who had betrayed her students, her family, and her community. The media amplified every detail of the case, turning it into a nationwide story that fueled debates about trust, morality, and the responsibilities of educators. Commentators dissected her actions, neighbors gave interviews about their disbelief, and strangers flooded social media with outrage. Rebecca became more than a woman on trial. She became a symbol of betrayal, her name forever associated with scandal. As the days dragged on, the weight of the trial took its toll on her. She lost weight rapidly, her face pale and drawn from sleepless nights. The confident teacher who once stood tall in front of classrooms now sat hunched and broken, her spirit visibly eroded. She no longer looked at the jury, no longer tried to defend herself with expressions of denial or regret. It was as though she knew the outcome was inevitable and could not summon the strength to fight. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent, guilty on all counts. The words sealed her fate, and Rebecca closed her eyes, absorbing the finality of it. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room, parents holding each other as if to steady themselves. The boys who testified sat quietly, their faces a mix of relief and lingering pain. Mark stood, walked out of the courtroom without looking back, and left Rebecca to face the reality she had created. Her sentencing hearing was equally grim. The judge spoke sternly, condemning her for abusing the trust placed in her as an educator. He emphasized the lasting damage done to her victims and the irreparable harm to the community. The sentence was long, decades in prison, ensuring she would spend most of her life behind bars. For Rebecca, it was the final blow. Her future, once filled with plans of family vacations, career milestones, and quiet suburban comfort, was gone forever. As she was led out of the courtroom, the cameras captured her one last time. The image of Rebecca Lewis, shackled and defeated, spread across every television and newspaper. She was no longer the admired teacher, no longer the wife and mother. She was the woman who had betrayed it all, a cautionary tale etched into the memory of everyone who had witnessed her rise and fall. Rebecca Lewis entered prison as an entirely different person than the one who had once stood at the front of a classroom, guiding students through literature and writing assignments. The gates clanged shut behind her, sealing away the life she had destroyed, and the reality of her sentence began to settle like a heavy weight pressing down on her shoulders. She no longer had the luxury of pretending, no longer had the distractions of her secret life to occupy her. All that remained was the cold certainty that she had thrown everything away. Her family was gone, her career obliterated, her reputation stained forever. What she had built over decades had been torn down in a matter of months, and the wreckage left behind would never be repaired. Inside the prison walls, Rebecca quickly discovered she was not just another inmate. Her case had made headlines, and the other women knew her story. Some mocked her, others despised her, and a few avoided her altogether. She was a cautionary tale even among those who had committed crimes themselves. Whispers followed her through corridors, pointing her out as the teacher who had destroyed her students' lives. Rebecca tried to disappear into the background, but the weight of her reputation clung to her no matter where she went. Back in the outside world, her name remained toxic. Her husband Mark finalized the divorce quickly, ensuring that Rebecca had no access to their children. He built a new life for them far from the town where the scandal had unfolded, determined that they would not carry the burden of her mistakes any more than they already had. The children, too young to fully grasp the details at the time, would grow up with the knowledge that their mother's crimes had been broadcast across the nation. They would come to understand that their lives were shaped not only by absence but by shame. The students Rebecca had entangled in her secret life faced their own struggles. Some were angry, furious at the manipulation and betrayal they had endured. Others wrestled with guilt, blaming themselves for not speaking up sooner. They were thrust into a spotlight they never wanted, their private pain dissected in courtrooms and news broadcasts. Years later, they would still feel the scars of being pulled into a scandal that had shaped their teenage years, leaving them distrustful and haunted by memories they could not erase. For the school and the community, the damage was permanent. Parents demanded stricter oversight, trust in teachers was shaken, and administrators faced lawsuits for not acting sooner. The once thriving high school now carried the stain of scandal, its reputation forever linked to the crimes of one woman. Teachers found themselves scrutinized for the smallest interactions with students, and the entire district became a place of suspicion and caution rather than trust and learning. Rebecca's actions had rippled far beyond her own downfall, poisoning everything they touched. Inside her cell, Rebecca replayed her choices over and over, searching for the moment where everything had gone wrong. She remembered the first late-night message, the first inappropriate glance, the first boundary she had crossed. Each decision had seemed small at the time, a secret thrill she believed she could contain. But each step led her further into the abyss until there was no way back. She had convinced herself she was in control, blind to the reality that her actions were spiraling toward disaster. Now, with nothing but time, she was forced to face the truth she had long denied. The media moved on to other scandals, but Rebecca's story remained burned into the memory of the town she had betrayed. Old friends cut ties, family members avoided speaking her name, and her former colleagues distanced themselves completely. Even years later, her name resurfaced whenever discussions of trust and betrayal arose. She had become a permanent example of how quickly a life could unravel when secrets and obsession replaced honesty and integrity. Her own parents, devastated by the disgrace, rarely visited. When they did, their eyes held a mixture of sadness and shame. They had raised her to succeed, to make something of herself, and now they struggled to reconcile the daughter they loved with the criminal she had become. Each visit was short, filled with awkward silences and heavy air, until eventually they stopped coming altogether. Rebecca was left truly alone, abandoned by nearly everyone who had once cared for her. In prison, the passing years blurred together. Days bled into nights, seasons into years, with nothing to mark time except the slow erosion of her spirit. She became quieter, more withdrawn, content to spend her days in solitude. Her once sharp mind dulled under the monotony of confinement, and her once confident presence shrank into obscurity. To the other inmates, she became just another broken figure, a woman defined by the mistakes she could never escape. Her story, however, continued to serve as a grim reminder outside the walls. Teachers in training were warned of her fate, her case studied in professional seminars as an example of how devastating the abuse of power could be. Parents whispered her name as a lesson in vigilance, a warning to never assume safety just because someone appeared trustworthy. Rebecca Lewis had become a cautionary tale, her life serving as a reminder of the dangers of secrecy, manipulation, and betrayal. Years later, as she sat alone in her cell, Rebecca realized there would be no redemption. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, inflicted damage that could never be repaired. Her children would grow up without her, her victims would carry scars forever, and her name would never be spoken without anger or shame. The weight of that truth crushed her more heavily than any prison walls ever could. She had begun as a teacher, entrusted with guiding young minds, and ended as a symbol of betrayal. Her story was not just about a woman who lost everything, it was about the ripples of destruction that spread when trust is broken and power is abused. In the end, Rebecca Lewis was left with nothing but regret, her life reduced to a warning etched in the memory of everyone who had heard her story.